She was the black sister no one ever talked about. Not really. Not outside of whispers. Not outside of the strained silences that clung to polite conversations. But at their parents' funeral, she stepped forward and revealed a secret that would change everything, a secret no one in that chapel was prepared for. The air inside the small chapel smelled faintly of lilies and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clung to the back of your throat and made grief taste even heavier. Mourners filled the pews, wrapped in stiff black suits and tear-streaked dresses, whispering condolences, dabbing their eyes, pretending to be brave. Everyone seemed to avoid the kind of silence that made loss feel too real, too sharp. At the front of the room, beneath a large stained glass window that filtered muted sunlight across the floor, two urns sat side by side. One was silver, the other pearl white, framed by carefully arranged photographs of a smiling couple who had once been known to this town as Samuel and Margaret Caldwell. The Caldwells' community pillars, always at church, always hosting charity drives, the kind of people others described as a blessing with misty-eyed admiration. People spoke about them as if goodness itself had worn their faces. But the room's attention wasn't on the urns anymore. It was on her. Standing in the very back of the chapel, still as stone, was a woman in her early 30s. Her skin was a rich, deep brown that seemed to drink in the muted light as she moved from the shadows into the clearing. She wore a simple black dress, elegant in its plainness, no frills, no glitter, no apologies. Her natural hair was pulled back into a low, soft puff, understated but deliberate, and her eyes, those eyes were calm, still, like a lake that had stopped expecting anyone to notice its depth. Her name was Lena Caldwell, though few here had spoken it aloud in years. She was Samuel and Margaret's adopted daughter, the one no one ever quite included, the one only mentioned when politeness demanded it. Lena hadn't planned to speak today, and most in the chapel had silently hoped she wouldn't. There had been murmurs when she walked in, not angry murmurs, but curious, unsettled ones. I didn't know she was coming. I thought she moved away years ago. They had all seen the Christmas cards over the years. Two handsome sons, Matthew and Daniel, always front and center. A golden retriever at their feet. A backyard barbecue scene framed by fairy lights and perfect smiles. Lena had never appeared in those pictures. She used to wonder when she would. She stopped wondering years ago. Lena had been adopted at 7, plucked from the foster care system after losing her biological mother. For a time, she believed she'd been chosen. Saved even. But that feeling had withered slowly beneath lingering stares. Jokes that never quite felt like jokes. And silences that hurt worse than words. She wasn't mistreated, not in the way people usually meant. She was tolerated like a guest who had long overstayed their welcome but whom the host didn't know how to ask to leave. Still, she had come today. She had driven across state lines, sat through 2 hours of eulogies, listened as Matthew spoke about his father's unshakable fairness and Daniel choked up describing their mother's boundless love for family. Lena did not cry. She had run out of tears years ago. And now, to everyone's silent disbelief, including her brothers whose narrowed eyes followed her from the front row, she stepped forward. Her heels clicked lightly against the polished floor with every step echoing in the quiet space with a deliberate calm that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. As Lena passed the rows of stiff mourners, some looked away. Some stared. A few seemed to brace themselves. When she reached the podium, she didn't adjust the microphone. She didn't clear her throat. She simply stood, letting the heavy silence gather around her like a second skin. She looked out over the room, the same room where she had once been told to smile wider for family photos, the same room where whispers about how sweet she was had followed her like perfume, a sweetness that felt more like dismissal than affection. In a voice both warm and steady, Lena said, "Thank you for being here today." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle like dust. Family was complicated. Lena had understood that truth earlier than most. What she learned and what she had lived was that being adopted and being accepted were two entirely different things. Worlds apart. She was 7 when she first arrived at the Caldwells' pristine 2-story colonial with its white shutters, manicured lawn, and a creaky porch swing that moved lazily in the breeze. It was a picture-perfect home, the kind you might find on the cover of a magazine. Neighbors brought over casseroles. Strangers called the Caldwells saints. How wonderful of them, they said, to take in one of those kids. She remembered clinging to a small pink backpack in their entryway, surrounded by bright smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Margaret knelt before her, all polished grace, and said, "From now on, you're one of us, sweetheart." Samuel ruffled her hair and chuckled, "In this house, we don't see color." At 7, Lena didn't understand what that meant. But by 10, she understood all too well. It meant pretending not to notice the stares when they walked into church. It meant knowing better than to expect to be introduced when Matthew and Daniel introduced their family. It meant laughing along when a visiting uncle joked about her wild hair and biting her tongue bloody when no one corrected him. It meant living on the edge of every family photo, every memory scene, but not fully. Matthew and Daniel were golden blonde-haired, blue-eyed, easy smiles. They shared inside jokes, private stories, photo albums thick with childhood memories Lena wasn't part of. Even when she was in the room, she wasn't in the frame. They never hurt her. Not in the way anyone could point to. But cruelty doesn't always wear fists. Sometimes it just looks like being left out over and over until you begin to wonder if you're really there at all. At school, they pretended she didn't exist. At home, they teased her nothing brutal, just sharp enough to sting. Always hidden beneath a "just kidding" or "you're too sensitive." When she tried to speak up, Margaret would smile thinly and say, "Boys will be boys, Lena." Samuel would sigh and remind her, "They don't mean anything by it." It was 1,000 tiny cuts covered with a band-aid and a forced smile. Lena learned early how to make herself small not in body but in presence. How to blend into the wallpaper. How to say thank you when gratitude tasted like betrayal. And now, standing in that chapel, she realized nothing had changed. Matthew had given her a tight nod when she arrived. Daniel mumbled a quick "hey" without lifting his eyes. No one offered her a seat beside them. She ended up in the second-to-last pew, surrounded by distant relatives who smiled thinly and whispered about her existence like a footnote in a novel they barely remembered reading. They mourned the same two people she once called Mom and Dad, but their grief was born from presence, from belonging. Lena's mourning was messier. She mourned not only their deaths but the love she had spent her whole life chasing and never catching. Still, she had come. Not because anyone asked. Not because anyone wanted her to. But because part of her, some tender, stubborn part that refused to die, still remembered the girl she once was. The girl who believed, standing in that white-tiled hallway clutching a backpack, that she had finally found home. The eulogies had poured in, each more polished than the last. Samuel and Margaret had opened their home to everyone, had raised their children with love, had lived lives of service and generosity. The words floated like petals through the air, beautiful, delicate, and hollow. Lena sat, unmoving, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unreadable. Behind her calm, the memories stirred. No one mentioned the Thanksgiving when she was 12, when Margaret quietly suggested it might be better for just the core family to pose for the annual photo. Lena had been guided off to the side with a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Smile anyway," her heart had pleaded. "Maybe they'll see you." They never did. No one mentioned the time Samuel's wallet went missing and Lena, and only Lena, was asked to empty her pockets. She had been 15. She had cried in the upstairs bathroom for hours afterward. Later, Margaret said, "It wasn't personal, darling. We just had to be sure." It was always personal. There were no mentions of the spring breaks and family trips she wasn't invited on. No acknowledgments of the birthdays quietly forgotten. The excuses. The unspoken reminders: be grateful. Be silent. Gratitude. That word had stalked her like a ghost for years. But Lena hadn't come to this funeral dragging gratitude behind her. She had come carrying something else. Something heavier. Tucked inside her purse, worn at the edges and smudged with old fingerprints, was a letter. A letter addressed to her. She found it weeks ago, hidden in a jewelry box she had never been allowed to touch. The handwriting was unmistakable, Margaret's elegant loops. It wasn't a long letter. Only 2 pages. But it was enough to shatter and rebuild everything Lena thought she knew. Margaret apologized. Apologized for letting the boys treat Lena as less. For standing silent. For hiding behind the hollow phrase, "we don't see color," while quietly allowing her daughter to be othered inside her own home. She admitted to being afraid of being called a bad mother, of facing her family's ugliness. "You were the bravest one," Margaret wrote. "I should have stood beside you." Lena had read that letter every night since. She kept it like a secret weapon, a fragile thing she wasn't ready to use. Until now. The chapel had fallen into a breathless silence as she approached the podium, every eye following her. Matthew and Daniel exchanged sharp glances. Disbelief. Fear. Lena didn't falter. When she reached the podium, she laid her hands lightly on either side, anchoring herself. And she spoke. Softly, clearly. I was 7 years old when I first walked into the Caldwell's home, she said, her voice weaving through the stunned quiet. I remember Mom's perfume. I remember Dad's laugh. A few people shifted in their seats. Matthew sat rigid, arms crossed. Daniel stared hard at the floor. Growing up, things weren't always easy, Lena continued. Sometimes love is hard to recognize. Sometimes it's not there at all. There was no accusation in her voice. Only truth. And then, with hands that did not tremble, Lena reached into her purse and pulled out the letter. She held it up so they could see. And then she read. Word by trembling word, she gave voice to everything Margaret had never said aloud, the regrets, the failures, the love too tightly hidden. By the time Lena reached the final paragraph, some mourners were wiping at their eyes. And then came the last reveal. I have made arrangements, Margaret's letter said, to ensure that the home you first walked into, the home you fought so hard to belong in, will always belong to you. Lena lowered the letter, folding it carefully. Mom left me the house, she said quietly. Gasps filled the chapel like a sudden summer storm. Heads whipped toward Matthew and Daniel. Their faces drained of color. But Lena didn't gloat. She simply stood taller. I didn't come here today for revenge, she said, voice steady. I came because truth deserves a voice, even when it's inconvenient. And then, with slow, deliberate steps, Lena left the podium and returned to her seat at the back. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of truth, of reckoning, of all the things left unsaid for far too long. She didn't look at Matthew. She didn't look at Daniel. She hadn't spoken for them. She had spoken for herself. For the little girl who once sat on that creaky porch swing, hoping someone would tell her she mattered. As the final amen echoed through the chapel, Lena sat perfectly still, feeling the sun warm her face through the stained glass window. And for the first time in her life, she knew she belonged. Not because they said so, because she said so. And that was enough.